You send the text. 3 words, nothing dramatic, nothing that should matter this much in 5 minutes. You watch the delivery status change from delivered to something else, your eyes locked on that tiny line of text like it's about to announce something important. Then it happens, that small gray word underneath the bubble. Read. No dots, no reply, just silence sitting there, time-stamped, refusing to move, refusing to explain itself, refusing to give you anything at all to work with. 2 words on a screen just rearranged your entire nervous system. This video is about why read without a reply triggers real anxiety. Not sadness exactly, not annoyance exactly, but a very specific, gut-level discomfort that comes from being seen and then, apparently, not being worth answering, at least not yet and maybe not ever. By the end of this, you'll understand why a read receipt taps into something older than smartphones, something your brain was tracking long before texting existed, long before phones existed, and something it still hasn't figured out how to switch off just because the threat is now digital. Start with what a read receipt actually removes. Ambiguity. Before read receipts existed, an unanswered text had a built-in excuse. Maybe they hadn't seen it yet. Maybe their phone had died. Maybe it slipped past them in a crowded inbox between a dozen other notifications. That excuse was doing real emotional work. It gave you somewhere to put the discomfort besides, they don't care. Dr. Ilana Gershon, a linguistic anthropologist at Indiana University who studies digital communication, has argued that removing the "maybe they didn't see it" option strips away the comfortable uncertainty that used to protect people from feeling personally rejected. Without that excuse, there's only one honest interpretation left standing, and your brain finds it fast, faster than you'd like, faster than feels fair. The read receipt doesn't just show you got seen. It shows you got skipped, deliberately, by a real person who chose, in that moment, to do something else instead. Your brain doesn't process no reply as neutral information, the way it might process a blank wall or an empty inbox. It processes it as a social threat signal, something closer to danger than to inconvenience. Naomi Eisenberger, a social psychologist at UCLA, ran a series of fMRI studies showing that social rejection activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same brain region activated by physical pain. In her research, participants played a simple virtual ball-tossing game with what they believed were 2 other real players. When those players stopped throwing the ball to them, excluding them from a game that meant nothing, their brains showed activation in pain-related regions within seconds. No insult required. No explanation given, just silence and exclusion. Being ignored doesn't feel like an emotion sitting quietly in your chest. It registers, physiologically, like an injury. This wiring isn't some modern glitch, a weird byproduct of having phones. It's ancient, inherited, older than language itself. Evolutionary psychologists point out that for most of human history, being ignored by your group wasn't a minor social slight you could shrug off. It was a survival risk with real consequences. A 2018 review published in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Review found that humans appear to have a hardwired ostracism detection system, a mechanism specifically tuned to notice social exclusion faster and more sensitively than almost any other social cue available to us, precisely because missing it once, back when you depended on your tribe for food and protection, could have been fatal. You're not overreacting to being left on red. You're running ancient software built for a much higher stakes, much smaller world. There's also a timing problem that read receipts specifically create, one that barely existed before this feature. Communication researcher Jeffrey Hancock at Stanford has studied how ambiguous digital silences get filled in, almost automatically, by the receiver's own anxieties, a phenomenon sometimes described as a silence gap. Without concrete information about why someone hasn't replied, your brain doesn't default to a neutral, boring guess. It defaults, reliably, to the worst plausible story available. They're mad at me. They're busy with someone else right now. I said something wrong. I always do this to people. An empty gap in information doesn't stay empty for long, and it certainly doesn't stay neutral. You fill it, almost against your will, drafting entire imagined conversations to explain a silence that probably has a boring, unremarkable cause, and you usually fill it badly, choosing the version of events that hurts the most. There's a comparison worth making here too, one that shows just how new this problem actually is. Before smartphones, letters could take days or weeks to arrive, and nobody sat refreshing their mailbox every 10 minutes wondering if their friend had opened the envelope yet, and simply decided not to write back. Even early phone calls had a built-in ambiguity. A busy signal, an answering machine, a missed connection that explained itself without anyone having to feel judged. Media researchers have pointed out that every new communication technology tends to strip away one more layer of plausible deniability, one more comfortable excuse, one more soft place to land, in exchange for speed and certainty we didn't necessarily ask for. Read receipts are simply the most recent, most efficient version of that trade. We gained information. We lost the soft landing that not knowing used to provide. Now, the wrinkle. The anxiety here isn't only about being ignored. It's also, quietly, about status, about rank, about where you stand in someone's life without ever being told directly. Sociologist Sherry Turkle, who has spent decades researching how technology reshapes human relationships, has noted that response speed has quietly become an informal marker of how much someone values you, whether anyone intended that or not. A fast reply reads as high regard, as being a priority. A read and ignored message reads as a demotion, even when the other person is simply in a meeting, driving, or asleep and thinking about you not even a little bit. We've collectively turned reply time into an accidental social hierarchy, ranking people by minutes and seconds, and nobody in particular ever sat down and agreed to these rules. They just formed on their own. The way rules tend to when enough people start behaving the same anxious way at once. There's a generational layer to all of this, too, one that's shifted the norms even further. Researchers studying texting habits among teens and young adults have found that many now treat instant replies as an unspoken obligation rather than a simple courtesy, with some describing genuine. Pressure to respond within minutes specifically, to avoid seeming distant, cold, or upset with someone. This creates a strange feedback loop. The same feature originally meant to reduce miscommunication has instead quietly raised the emotional stakes attached to every single unanswered message. The tool built to remove guesswork ended up handing everyone a brand new reason to guess. There's also a strange asymmetry in how this plays out depending on who's on which side of the screen. Studies on digital communication anxiety have found that people tend to judge themselves far more harshly for leaving someone on read than they judge others for doing the exact same thing to them. You know, rationally, that you've left plenty of messages unanswered for perfectly boring reasons. You were driving, you were in the shower, you simply forgot. Yet, when the roles reverse, that same generous explanation rarely occurs to you first. The double standard isn't really about logic. It's about which side of the silence you happen to be sitting on. There's one more piece worth mentioning, something almost funny about how contradictory we are on this topic. Survey research on messaging habits has repeatedly found that most people admit to leaving others on read regularly, often without a second thought, while simultaneously reporting real distress when it happens to them. Almost nobody thinks of themselves as the villain in this particular story, the quiet offender leaving other people staring at their own version of that same gray word. Everyone has a reasonable excuse for their own, silence and a suspicious theory for everyone else's. That gap between how we treat our own unanswered messages and how we interpret other people's is less about hypocrisy and more about information. You have full access to your own reasons and none at all to theirs. So your brain, starved of real data, quietly writes the worst version of the story it can. Here's the darker layer, the one that complicates everything above. Some people have started leaving messages unread on purpose, deliberately, using the read receipt itself as a message, a small weapon disguised as an accident. Silence, once purely accidental, has quietly become a tool people reach for on purpose. A way to punish, to create distance, to make someone wait without ever having to say a single word out loud. Some people have even developed small rituals around it. Opening a message in airplane mode specifically so it won't register as read, buying themselves time without giving anything away. Which means the anxiety you feel reading that gray read isn't always irrational, isn't always your ancient wiring misfiring for no reason, alarmed over nothing at all. Sometimes the silence really is the answer. You're just not going to get it in writing, and some quiet part of you already knows that, which is exactly why it stings as much as it does. You're back at your phone, exactly where you started. The message still says read. No dots, no reply.